Good morning and good afternoon to those of you joining from Europe. As folks trickle in, it is 11 a.m. Eastern time here in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to see so many people on the line for this webinar today. I'm Alina Polyakova. I am President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, coming to you from Washington, D.C., and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity and really the honor to chair and moderate this discussion on a fantastic new book that is officially being released in the United States by Oxford University Press on June 1. So this is a preview of Future War and the Defense of Europe. I have my own copy of the book right here. Encourage all of you on the line, as I think you'll hear, there's some really important takeaways from this new book, some quite terrifying predictions as well if the alliance isn't able to get its act together and be better prepared for what the future will look like in the not too distant future. And I'm so pleased and truly grateful and honored to be joined by the book's three co-authors and a very distinguished panel of experts on all of these issues. Retired General John Allen, who is currently serving as the president of the Brookings Institution. Welcome, John. Great to see you and have you with us. We have SIPA's own Pershing Chair, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. Ben, always a pleasure to do this with you. And of course, Professor Dr. Julian Lindley-French, who is joining us from Europe as well, alongside General Hodges. As I mentioned, the book will be released June 1st, but because all of you are here with us today to listen to this discussion, we'll be dropping off a link to a discount that you can use with Oxford University Press. So you can get 30% off. Many thanks to Oxford University for doing that. But I think it's important to get into the substance of the conversation. You know, the book touches on the critical nexus between technology, geopolitics, and the future of warfare. These are three themes that are not only critical to today's transatlantic policy conversation, but are also very close to our work here at the Center for European Policy Analysis over the years. Last year, recognizing some of the urgent threats and challenges we see with the rapid advancement of new and emerging technologies, SIPA launched our Defense Technology Initiative, led by our very own Lawrence Speranza, to enhance transatlantic defense cooperation around emerging and disruptive technology. We've also stood up a digital innovation initiative that's focusing on ensuring a democratic digital domain when it comes to how we lay the groundwork and guidelines around new and emerging technologies such as AI, quantum computing down the road, and many others. Our transatlantic defense and security program has been also leading a campaign on the future of hybrid warfare. And this conversation comes at such a timely point as the alliance itself is thinking about how we need to be better prepared for 2030. NATO, of course, has launched its own reflection process. I'm sure at the NATO summit in June, we'll be hearing much more about some of the results of that reflection process. And SIPA has been supporting that work that NATO has been carrying out in the reflection expert group all along the way. And I'm just so delighted to have this conversation about how the shifts in all these areas, technology, geopolitics, and warfare, are revolutionizing and in some ways challenging Europe's defense and the future of the alliance. So let me just introduce our speakers, and then we'll take it over directly into the substance of the conversation. And as we're having this discussion, we will have an opportunity for all of you who are joining us on this webinar today. As a reminder, this is on the record discussion, and you will have an opportunity to please ask questions of this distinguished group of writers, of experts, former military service men, General John Allen, who served as president of the Brookings Institution since 2017, where I had the absolute pleasure of working with him for several years before I joined SIPA, and it was a real honor. Before Brookings, General Allen had a distinguished nearly 4-decade career in the US Marine Corps, where he served as commander of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and the US forces in Afghanistan. John, I've always learned so much from you. It's so great to see you, and such a personal pleasure for me to have you here with us. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Alina.
We also have joining us, as I mentioned, Professor Dr. Julian Lindley-French, who's currently chairman of the Alphen Group in the Netherlands and is a leading author, advisor, and strategist who's published now more than 11 books, I believe, and numerous articles. And he was the lead author of one of SIPA's key reports, the military mobility. Julian, we're very grateful for all the work you've done with us at SIPA and our continued engagement with you. It's really wonderful to have you. Welcome. And last and certainly not least, to our very own General Ben Hodges, who's the Pershing Chair at SIPA, and of course, a leading voice in everything from military mobility to Black Sea security. We've had the privilege of working with Ben since his retirement from the US Army in 2018, where his last assignment, he was commander of US Army Europe. Ben, I'm so grateful for everything you do for SIPA and the Alliance, and that we have the opportunity to discuss this new important book project with you today. So as a reminder, if you have questions as we're going through this for this on-the-record discussion, please use the Q&A function. The chat is not functioning purposely so. So please, if you have questions throughout this, I'll be keeping an eye out in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Please do direct your questions to our panelists. So let's get down to business. Julian, if I may, let me just start with you. Just give us a sense of why this book and why now? Why was it important to focus on future war and especially the defense of Europe? And why are we having this event today in particular?
Thank you, Alina, and thank you to you and your team for putting this great event together. You know, this book grew out of the GlobSec NATO Adaptation Initiative, which John led, of which I had the honor to be a part, and as a co-author of the Military Mobility Report with Ben and Heiner Braus. All of these elements, if you look at all of these reports, come to a single point, which is that Europe and its defense is at a crossroads. That there is an urgent need to align defense policy with strategy, with industry, with technology, with reality, given the changes that are taking place in and around Europe. And that includes America's reality, by the way, that you know, the United States is facing ever-growing pressures worldwide, and all the assumptions that Europeans have grown up with since 1949 and NATO now have to be challenged. That is why we are very clear in the book. And that is why the book is now about future war and the defense of Europe. You know, what could go wrong?
You know, John, let me just take it over to you to start to fill in some of the initial framing comments. I think one of the key takeaways from the book, as Julian was just beginning to outline, is that Europeans need to do far more for their own defense, and that the taken for granted reality that we've all come to accept over the years is peace in Europe. But that's really no longer something we can rely on for the foreseeable future, given some of the rapidly changing dynamics. And John, I know you've worked for years now, certainly at Brookings and before that, in really bringing greater attention to some of the challenges presented by new and emerging technology. And that's a big focus of the book. Chapter 8 in particular really outlines this idea of hyperwar, which I know you've written about in the past. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you're thinking and how the book delves into some of these dynamics about future technologies and what that might mean for the defense of the alliance in Europe in particular?
Well, let me also echo Julian's comments about thanking you for your leadership at SIPA, but also thanking your great team for putting this on today. As it is for Julian, this is a very personal issue for me as well. I'll just very quickly say that my grandfather was one of the very first American units that was attacked with poison gas during the First World War. He was debilitated by it and suffered the rest of his life and died a very young man, relatively speaking. My father on board the U.S. destroyer, latest technology of the day, Fletcher-class destroyer. If anyone's seen the movie Greyhound, that was his experience. Was involved in secretly at the time, because we were not yet in World War II, secretly convoying British convoys from Canada and the United States to Great Britain. He was torpedoed by a German U-boat in the middle of the Atlantic in November of '41, even before we were in the war. That gas, that submarine, those were emerging technologies, highly sophisticated technologies for their time, all of which had the capacity ultimately to have dramatic battlefield impact. Later, as the commander in Afghanistan, I would be given the opportunity to apply a number of advanced technologies, largely in surveillance and intelligence, which gave me an edge on the enemy's capacity to operate in the cyber environment that was nearly decisive. So I became very, very interested, and have been for many years, in this Clausewitzian relationship between the character of war, which is technology, and the nature of war, which is the human dimension. And in the context of technology, technology is not just changing, Alina, as we say in the book. The rate of change of technology is so great that it's virtually mind-boggling on how fast technology is changing. And so we have to stay ahead of this.
Yeah.
We have to understand what technology can do. We have to understand how it can be applied. And it's extraordinarily important that as we go forward as an alliance, but more broadly, and I want to thank again the work of CIPA, the idea of a community of democracies being able to aggregate their technological capabilities and to ensure that at a human level, we're up to the task, that we're able to prevail in the end. And so as technology has evolved, it has given greater capacity to operate in the hybrid warfare environment, which is basically below the line of kinetic response in many respects. It's difficult for attribution. It hasn't yet violated treaty sanctions or treaty limits. Hybrid warfare has been enhanced dramatically by evolving technologies, as has the whole environment of the cyber domain. We've just recently seen in the United States, many of the Americans will be tuning in today, but certainly many of the folks around the world who are tuning in, saw the absolute effect of a hack from a non-state actor. We don't know whether it was a surrogate for the Russians or simply a criminal, transnational criminal entity, the dark side, which ultimately hacked into and stopped the flow of much of the natural gas and petroleum in the East Coast of the United States. We are still suffering, even though it's flowing again, we're still suffering economically from that. So the cyber dimension, whether it's cyber espionage, cyber criminality, cyber terror, or cyber warfare, the whole cyber domain has changed the character of conflict. And then finally, as we have seen increases in computing power, as we have seen greater availability of big data, as we have seen more sophisticated artificially intelligent algorithms, we have seen that the capacity to operate with autonomy in intelligence collection or command and control, or even autonomous weapon systems, has been accelerated dramatically. And when we use the term hyperwar now, it's not about artificial intelligence. It's about warfare that has been accelerated to such an extent that the actual role of the human, the nature of war, starts to come into question. So these are dramatic changes. And the questions then that emerge for us and for NATO and for our partners is, are we adequately and sufficiently comprehensively defining what deterrence means in this environment now where the cyber domain can sometimes be the decisive domain? Are we adequately thinking about the relationship between our nuclear capabilities, our conventional capabilities in the physical sphere, but also our cyber capabilities, both to augment and to defend ourselves? So these are big questions. Are we investing properly? Is our operational readiness to the highest level? Are we ensuring that modernization embraces these changes in technology, while at the same time we are recruiting the right kinds of young women and men who can lead and operate and decide and fight in a hyperwar environment, something moving so fast, it's difficult even to get your head around. So as we think about the future of the alliance, and I have to commend NATO dramatically for the great work that it is doing in trying to imagine a future. The kind of future that we talk about in this book, Future War and the Defense of Europe, is one that while in, let's say, December of 1913, people could not have imagined that 5 years hence, couldn't imagine 20 million dead just 5 years hence. They couldn't have imagined a war that large. Today, people are saying there's just no chance for a war that large in Europe. We need to be thinking about what the changes in technologies have given advantage to our opponents, the Russians in Europe and the Chinese in East Asia, who increasingly are a factor in Europe. So I hope that gets to your question. I'm sorry to go on so long, but that's really my interest in contributing to this book. And I think it's sort of a central theme throughout the effort.
No, well, thank you, John. And those of you who I hope will pick up the book, you'll see that the opening vignette of the book is a quite chilling view of a very real feeling type of war environment that we may see in the not too distant future. I think this is the main point that I took away from reading the book over the weekend, was that even though we're talking about future threats, they feel very real today. And it's not much of a leap in the imagination to imagine where we could end up if we don't invest in the kinds of capabilities, better preparedness that you started to outline, John. Julian, I know we got interrupted earlier. Let me take you back over to you. I think one of the concepts that John is also referencing to, alluding to, that's introduced in the book, that I hope we'll get to later, is this idea of digital deterrence. And I think, Ben, you'll help us unpack that a bit. But Julian, I want to pan out a little bit and give you an opportunity to also respond to some of the ideas that John has started to introduce about the initial inspiration for this book, as you started to point to in your opening comments, please.
Thank you. Well, John very eloquently as ever picked up exactly where I left off, or where I was disconnected. So we're a team, and I'm very happy that we're able to do that. Look, in some ways, the book should be called Future Peace and the Defense of Europe, because it's really about preserving the peace of Europe in a very changed strategic environment that's changing very rapidly, in which there are so many pressures on the leaders of welfare states in Europe that defense often gets crowded out. And sometimes the only way that one can communicate the threat is graphically, which we do in the book. So, having prepared the GlobSec NATO Adaptation Initiative report in 2017, having worked with Ben on military mobility, it was very clear we had to make a big, strong statement, and that's what the book does. And at its heart is a new idea of deterrence. It's not just about conventional military deterrence or nuclear deterrence. It's about deterrence across the information space, across the cyberspace, because that's exactly what our adversaries are using against us. They're using the strength of open societies to weaken us. And we've got to build a fundamental commodity to our future defense. That's resiliency. And if you ask me what the essential partnership at the core of the book is, it's a partnership between the people of democracies the world over and how we protect ourselves. And in some extent, the pandemic has shown a willingness of populations in democracies to adapt to threat, but also the proven ability to project influence and power against adversaries so that they understand that it would be a profound mistake to believe they have opportunities that don't exist, that they would pay a big price if they were to be so mistaken. So the book has both a didactic element, but also a policy, and if I may say so, a strategic communications aspect to it, which we set as one of our major missions.
Well, thank you, Julian, for giving us that very key overview of some of the takeaway you're trying to get across with the book, and I do think it comes through very clearly just having read it. We already have quite a few questions coming in through the Q&A. Encourage all of you in our audience to keep putting those questions in. I will get to them as soon as possible. But before we take it over to our audience, of course, General Hodges, Ben, John started to talk about the kind of nexus of technology, defense and deterrence that we need to put in place to avoid the kinds of, should I say, nightmare scenarios of the book really, I think gets your heart beating when you start reading it at the onset. And I think one of the points that Julian makes is about this idea of resilience, that we really need to think about resilience as a core part of defense. One of the key themes that's been emerging in our debate over collective defense of the alliance, and John mentioned NATO as being obviously the key actor here when we're thinking about collective transatlantic defense and security, is this question of where should and how should Europe do more? And much of this discussion has evolved around a somewhat ambiguous term of strategic autonomy for several years. So I was hoping you might be able to help us make sense of that. In the US, we have this desire for the US to do more defense, but many don't necessarily think it should happen through a European Union framework due to the risk of duplication with NATO and things of that nature, or some sort of decoupling from the US, which would make us less resilient, some would argue, in the face of challenges from states like Russia and China. Do you think the ideas of European strategic autonomy and the transatlantic bond are mutually exclusive from that perspective? Is there a way to actually make them mutually reinforcing in advance of that? So Ben, what are your thoughts?
So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. In fact, they are essential for each other. The U.S. economy depends entirely on a secure and stable European economy. Our prosperity depends on European prosperity. So even if European countries didn't spend one dime on defense, we would still be, we would need a stable, secure Europe for our own benefit. And so I don't see any scenario where the U.S. kind of just turns away from Europe and takes our ball and goes home. All of our best and most reliable allies come from Europe, as well as Canada and Australia. Now, so when you hear people talk about we need a strong European pillar, not a European pillow, of course, what we're talking about are European allies that are able to deter the Kremlin without significant American physical presence, because of the possibility, and I would even say the likelihood, that we're going to be involved in a kinetic conflict in the Indo-Pacific region within the next 5 years. And most of the stuff that we would be needing would be our great Navy, our great Air Force, intelligence, and special forces. And those are the kind of things that our European allies have got to be able to provide in sufficient quantity and quality in order to deter Kremlin aggression, as well as contain Iran and be on the lookout for what China might be trying to do as well. But the key is not whether or not there's a European army or strategic autonomy. The key is European leaders acknowledging that there's a threat. If they're not even willing to acknowledge that there are bad people in the Kremlin and in Beijing that want to or willing to use force or other means, then it doesn't matter what the framework is, because then they won't have the political will to do the things necessary to ensure proper investment in defense, and also the really, really hard decisions that are policy decisions that ensure interoperability so that British, American, Dutch, French, Polish, Romanian, et cetera, and British forces can work together.
Well, thank you, Ben. And we have some really interesting questions coming in from the audience that I'm going to mix in here. We have a very knowledgeable audience joining us here today. I'll just put it that way. But I want to give John and Julian, this is really a question for both of you. One of the concepts that we recently discussed at SIPA with August Cole, who of course has been one of the authors when it comes to thinking about future war, at least in a fictionalized environment, but unfortunately it doesn't feel very much like fiction anymore. He, at a recent SIPA event, August Cole mentioned this idea of a sixth domain of warfare to account for the human or cognitive element of conflict that all of you have alluded to here. In the book, you talk about this notion of 5D warfare, disinformation, deception, destabilization, disruption, and coercion via implied or actual destruction. I mean, to my mind, all of those certainly have a human element. So how can we as Americans and Europeans better equip our militaries and our societies to grapple with these threats in the cognitive domain. I think in the United States, certainly the Pentagon and various agencies in the Department of Defense have been struggling with what their role is in that specific environment. So, John, perhaps let me start with you, and Julian, I'd love to hear from you to that question as well.
Yeah, I'll defer to Julian on the 5D. It's a very important concept. Look, as I said earlier, Lena, the idea of the character and the nature of war are really foremost in a lot of people's thinking. And what we have, in many respects, failed to do is to ensure that the human component of conflict and war has been kept in pace in both understanding, scaling, exploiting, and deploying the kinds of technologies that are coming. Now, that's the human cognitive piece of this, but also in the context of cognitive awareness and warfare is the sophistication of the technologies that are coming as well. Artificially intelligent systems aren't present today to the point where they are employed at least by the West, and I'll use the West as in a particular sense here, as a lethal autonomous weapon system. That's an entire debate we could talk about today if you'd like. But we're moving in that direction, and I think we have very strong indications that the Russians and the Chinese are not as we are. When I say we, I mean North America and Europe. I mean the EU, I mean NATO. We're all wedded to the rule of law. We're all committed to international humanitarian law and the law of armed conflict. And one of the things that Ben said, which is very important, is that our closest allies in many respects are in Europe. Now, we've got very close allies in East Asia and Australia. But the thing we do share is our values. And as we move forward, as we begin to think about how cognitive systems or autonomous systems that are artificially intelligent, as we begin to think about the role that they'll play, we need to understand what the implications are for our values. Our opponents are not going to be so constrained in their thinking. And I do believe that we will see a time when our forces that are augmented with systems that have cognitive capabilities, the loyal wingman, for example, where we're seeing advanced manned Air Force aircraft being accompanied by highly sophisticated drone aircraft, or swarms of artificially intelligent systems, whether they're ground systems or aerial systems, that actually work together, learn from each other, and when one is destroyed because they are cognitively networked, the others can pick up the mission immediately with no loss of time. That is not a pipe dream. That is a reality, and we are working towards having the capability. The question is whether we'll field it or not. And for now, we are still, I think, mired in the conversation. I mean, mired in a positive sense. We're still mired in the conversation about where our values are with respect to the employment of highly sophisticated technologies that have a cognitive dimension to them themselves. And as I said, there's the character of war and there's the nature of war. The nature of war has always dominated the character of war, and when it falls behind, the chances are very great of strategic surprise. So it's very important that the nature of war, the human dimension, is fully aware of and capable of controlling. This is the key, controlling the artificial intelligence and ultimately the sophisticated technologies in the battle space. Now, at some point, we may reach a point where the cognition of some of these systems is so great, it begins to replace the human in the supervision of the business of taking life and in destroying infrastructure. That's a moment that we must carefully consider as we go forward, if we are in fact to remain true to our values. But I'm not so sure our opponents are going to be that way. And this is something that it's a big issue. You and I have talked before about standards and conditions of behavior and how we will have the conversation with our opponents about cognition and warfare. Yeah. And we've got to have that conversation. We negotiated with the Soviets very successfully over arms control for many years. We've had understandings with the Chinese about the use of thermonuclear weapons for many years, even though they were our opponents or even our enemies. We've got to be having that conversation now as well. I hope I answered your question, Lena.
Thank you, John. And I think the point you make about the reality that we cannot simply isolate ourselves to our alliance structures. And we never did that during the Cold War period, yet that's a very imperfect way of thinking about the kind of multipolarity we face in the world today. Yet we have to maintain those open channels of communication, military to military relations, with our allies, of course, but as well as with our adversaries. Go ahead, John.
Let me come right back in and say, this is bigger than NATO.
Yeah.
This is bigger than Europe.
Yeah.
There was a long time when the chauvinist West believed that they had an edge on democracy and values. The truth, of course, is in East Asia, some of the most successful, technologically advanced, human rights committed, if you will, pardon my language, human rights committed states are Asian. And now is the time that we should be thinking more globally about a community of democracies that are technologically advanced and the governments of those democracies equally committed to human rights and the value of human life as we are. We've got to be able to think in those terms. And when we have China, a near peer competitor, maybe a peer competitor in a not too distant future, we can't afford to be exclusive in how we think about this. We've got to be inclusive in how we think about this, to your point you made very early along, Alina, in this conversation.
Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julian, please go ahead.
Well, I haven't got much to add, but why do we call for stronger militaries in the Western democracies? We call for them because we believe if we are to preserve the institutional framework that has made the world reasonably secure in the last 50, 60 years, then we have to underpin those institutional frameworks with some credible hard power. Our adversaries, on the other hand, seem to be moving back towards a kind of Machtpolitik, which so scarred Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's what's at stake. And that's why the word cognitive is so important, because this is the contrast between warfare and lawfare. Let's be blunt about this. And the image, the vision that John offers of, on the one side, an ethical, human, cognitive concept of international relations, including warfare, I might add, and the August cold nightmare of an unethical, artificial cognitive military machine is something we all have to guard against. And to my sense, we need sufficient military power to convince our adversaries that it's better to invest in lawfare than see warfare as a shortcut to what they believe are their interests. That's it. That's the message of the book. It's almost going back to Teddy Roosevelt. Speak softly, but carry a big stick. Because if you speak softly, you invite others to be with you. And that is the essential contest of the age. It might not be ideological like the Cold War, but it is no less pressing a contest. Alina?
Thank you, Julian. I want to start bringing in some of the audience questions, which are picking up on the themes that we're discussing here. And one of the points I will just comment on quickly from my perspective as someone who hasn't worked directly on some of the military issues that we're discussing here today, but certainly on the non-kinetic issues that are increasingly becoming part of a broader vision of defense and deterrence and resilience. This question that John, that you really highlighted about continuing engagement with our allies, building a global community of democracies to tackle some of the challenges we're discussing, and continuing to let our values be the underpinning behind all of our thinking when it comes to deterrence in the defense and security space, as well as societal resilience more broadly. And I think I have certainly seen recently a debate that has been there for a long time, but seems to be really taking shape right now about whether it should just be interests rather than values that drive US foreign policy in particular, including in the defense and security space. And to me, I find this perspective quite troubling, to put interests or particular instrumental interests above values. But I think this is very much a key takeaway from the book and from what you just said, John. And I want to just put a pin in that. And if you want to comment on it, we can come back to it, because I want to take it over to Ben for just a moment, because we have a question from one of our very own fellows here at SIPA, who's also a fellow with NATO now as well, one of their emerging leaders there, Tanya Latici. So Ben, let me give you an opportunity to respond to Tanya's very good question, where she says, the book often mentions the concept of comprehensive security. We've been talking about that already, and explains that concept as embodying a harmony between human security and national defense. So Tanya's question is, how can this concept be translated into transatlantic or European national policy? What are your thoughts on Tanya's question, Ben?
Well, first of all, I'm glad Tanya's on our side and not working for the enemy. She's one of the smartest, hardest working people I've ever met.
Yeah.
And the European Parliament is lucky to have her advising them as well. You know, the question of values is really so important, because that's what binds us together. If it's just interest, then an alliance is going to come apart pretty quickly. We had a brush with interest-based diplomacy the last 4 years, and it really damaged cohesion with our allies and most important partners. So this transatlantic relationship has to be based on shared values, not just the strategic interests. And when you're talking about competing against the Kremlin or the Chinese Communist Party or Iran, if we are not living up to our own values to begin with, then we are really undermined in our ability to influence what they do. And I think citizens in those countries, if they don't see us, West and our allies, living up to those kinds of values, then I don't think we're going to be a very effective or compelling deterrent force.
Can I add briefly to that? Values is who we are. The juxtaposition of values and interests and the separation of the two is a non-question, because we cannot separate values and interests. Central to the book is this idea of a partnership with our citizens. They are central to the future defense of Europe. And our citizens are who they are, and they won't accept a kind of 19th century return to European imperialism a la realpolitik. We are modern liberal democracies, and the relationship between values and interests is a fused one, and therefore central to how we make policy and indeed how we act.
Thank you, Julian. And John, let me take it over to you for another question from the audience that I think is very much in your area of interest as well. One of our audience member asks, what are your takeaways from the conflict we just saw erupt between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East? And this is an interesting question. Could it be that Europe needs something like an Iron Dome? Is that within the realm of possibilities here? And is that really the way forward? John?
As you probably know, I did 2 tours specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So I've got a lot of opinions on it. Happily for me, the question is really about a technology and a tactical issue. Look, Iron Dome is an exceptional capability. I've actually had Iron Dome missiles intercept Hamas rockets over my head. So I deeply appreciate that technology. We've had conversations in the past about a comprehensive missile defense system for Europe. It is fraught on the issues associated with who we're defending against, whether we're defending against the Russians, which some might ultimately stipulate as a destabilizing capability, were we to be able to field a theater ballistic missile defense capability and then a tactical ballistic missile defense capability, either in form of Patriot or Iron Dome. So we say it's not about the Russians, we say it's about the Iranians. Okay, that's good enough. We should pursue the kinds of defensive ballistic missile defense capabilities, anti-ballistic, anti-missile or counter-missile capabilities, whether those are cyber or other advanced technologies. We should pursue those technologies to defend the people of Europe. And it ought to be part of how we go about thinking of the comprehensive integrated deterrence that gives our opponents pause in knowing that if no matter what they throw at us, while we may not throw something back, we have the capacity to defend ourselves, and defend ourselves can come in various forms and fashions. So that's a good question, and we should be thinking about it. Iron Dome is a great capability. At the strategic, operational, and tactical level, we have the technical capabilities of doing that. If we have the capacity to, or the capability or the will to invest to achieve that, that's another question.
Absolutely. And Ben, I know you want to chime in here, but I wanted to highlight that John just brought in this idea of integrated deterrence, which is, of course, we've heard the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, also referenced this as, and it's also one of the questions we have from one of our audience members coming to us from Bucharest, which I know Romania and the Black Sea region is something that you have spent a lot of time worrying about and trying to get other people to worry about. And of course, that's something that we've been also advancing here from a SIPA perspective. And so the audience member asks, this idea of, quote, the right mix of technology, operational concepts, and capabilities, they're all woven together, as John was describing as well, in a networked way in order to give an adversary pause. How would the US and our allies in Europe need to rethink this idea of traditional deterrence into this in the framework of integrated deterrence to deal effectively with the changing character of war? But I know you also wanted to probably come in the Middle East discussion we're having here in the Iron Dome. So Ben, let me give you an opportunity to chime in here.
Thank you. Well, Ilya Tuchter's question about Iron Dome for Europe is a great one. It doesn't matter to me what system is, as long as it's effective. The key is we do not have enough air and missile defense capability in Europe today to protect European citizens, let alone critical infrastructure or other critical assets. This is our biggest vulnerability in Europe today, is integrated air and missile defense. And it's a combination of sensors and shooters, ground-based, air-based, space-based capabilities, and of course, maritime-based capabilities. This is where I think if we had a much more sophisticated approach to what 2% is and burden sharing is, instead of clubbing our most important allies over the head about 2%, instead say, hey, look, Germany, you are the critical, the center of gravity from a deployment and reinforcement perspective. Host nation support from Germany should include air and missile defense for most of the Baltic Sea, for example. And I think most Germans, no matter what party, could get behind the idea of protecting European citizens more than the idea of, hey, you're not spending 2%. So this is an area where I think a sophisticated approach to burden sharing could help address our biggest vulnerability. Lithuania has purchased NASAMS, but Estonia and Latvia do not have the budget to purchase high-end air and missile defense. So this has got to be done by somebody else to help protect our allies. And for sure, it's going to be integrated, because the sensor is going to be in 3 or 4 different countries. The headquarters is going to be networked through multiple countries. And then the shooter that's got to shoot down, whether it's a missile or an airplane, is going to be all over the continent of Europe. And I am very worried that we have not even had a theater-wide joint multinational air and missile defense exercise in at least the last 11 years that tested the whole thing. And if you think that, I mean, all of us experience dropping off of Zoom calls, because the communications infrastructure is fragile. Wait till you're under attack from a state actor that's pulling every cyber switch that they have and try to connect multiple nations' air and missile defense. This is a vulnerability. So Ilya's question is a good one.
Well, thank you, Ben. And Julian, there's another interesting question coming from the audience as well that I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to. And it's really, it's coming from Mihai Giboy. And the question is, as you emphasize on the technological impacts of military threats and future war, what are your thoughts on utilizing space as a potential theater of war? And how does that connect to some of the core themes in the book?
Well, space is obviously one of the multi-domains in which, in many ways, regrettably, warfare is now leaching into. It had been pretty much forbidden under various treaties, but technology is such that it's simply a fact. Whether we like it or not, there's military satellite communications, there's surveillance, there's increasing the possibility of kinetic systems being stationed in space, particle weapons, and other advanced emerging and disruptive technologies will increasingly be part of the architecture of warfare in which we're engaged. Now, our adversaries seem to have little a problem with establishing such architectures. If that is the case, we have no alternative but to go high, because it could be a critical vulnerability in our own defense if we are not able to have a credible space-based element of a broad-based defense in the future. It's just the nature of technological advancement.
Thank you, Julian. I have a question that if any one of you wants to take up, and it's kind of a combination of questions from the audience as well as my own interest in this space, of course, and that really has to do with the talent piece that you alluded to, John. How do we recruit technologically capable, savvy young men and women to serve in our forces, in public service more broadly? And this, of course, relates to this reality that we find ourselves in, where governments are no longer driving innovation when it comes to technology, as perhaps was the case in the 20th century. In the 21st century, a lot of the innovation is being driven by the private sector, of course. And of course, a lot of the talent is going there because they get better salaries, frankly, than they do working for the DoD or any other government agency. So what is the role of the private sector in all this, as we're thinking about better preparedness, better digital deterrence, resilience, and all of the issues we're talking about today? How do we work together? Is there an opportunity to work together? Can we still really recruit the top talent as we used to be able to work in government? How do we start to wrap our minds around that particular issue going forward? John, I see you took yourself on mute, so if you want to take that, please.
I'll just jump in very quickly and then offer my colleagues the chance. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago to work on a commission within the U.S. Naval Service about education. And one of the first things we did was have a conversation about the character versus the nature of war. And of course, the U.S. Navy is an extraordinarily technologically sophisticated organization. And the question we asked ourselves was, have we taken the steps necessary amongst our senior leaders and our younger leaders to both recruit the kinds of young women and men who are going to be able to operate in an increasingly technologically advanced, rapidly unfolding combat environment? Or are we just recruiting as usual? And the answer is we are both recruiting as usual, and we had not really examined our system of education to ultimately embrace the realities of what hyperwar could bring to us. I was really pleased to see that at an institutional level, we embraced from the top to the bottom, from the most senior leaders to our most junior leaders, a commitment ultimately to begin to educate them systematically for the digital environment, for the cyber domain, and ultimately for the potential realities of hyperwar, because the change in technology of naval weapon systems in all physical domains, naval space, naval air, naval surface, naval subsurface, and then autonomous capabilities in all of those areas, really begins to cause your brain to spin. So that's the first thing. Are we, in fact, as a group of militaries within the context of the alliance, are we committing ourselves to a recruitment process and ultimately an education, a lifelong education in uniform that embraces the realities of the digital horizon that's coming at us? And the second thing is, and this I think is in many respects a function of the capitalist system, the really smart kids are going off into the private sector. So the question then becomes, for the individual capitals and the alliance and the EU, perhaps, and North America with the EU, are we prepared to take a dramatic step forward as a community and begin to invest in STEM for our young women and men going forward. To invest in them from the high school level through college, and when they come out of college, because we invested in them and we're willing to pay them a living wage, have them then move into, for example, government service of some form or another. Are we systematically, as a community of nations, investing in STEM, ultimately to set the conditions intellectually for that human dimension of the more sophisticated, technologically advanced characteristics of war?
Thank you, John. Julian, I think I saw you nodding here if you want to chime in, but before you do, I did
Ben
want to.
wanted, yeah, Ben wanted to say something. Yeah.
Oh, sure. I'll give both of you an opportunity to chime in here. I wanted to throw another question out there for you to respond to if you'd like, that I thought was quite interesting from one of our audience members. This idea of the Hyperloop, which is a sort of high-speed travel system and pods. And the audience members asking whether you think that is not so futuristic anymore to have in a place like Europe. And this is something that Elon Musk has also discussed in some years and has tested some version of this type of travel that allow people to move at 760 miles per hour. Is this really a futuristic idea, or is it now becoming reality? But Ben, let me hand it over to you, and then Julian, feel free to chime in on this particular question or anything else that we've been discussing so far.
So on the technology, the United States Army has to bring in every year 130,000 new privates and lieutenants. That's the requirement every year just to maintain our level. So we're competing with everybody, not just other services, but industry, universities, business, for people that can be successful as a private or a lieutenant in the United States Army. Fortunately, young people today adapt to technologies much faster than I ever could have when I was 18, 19, 20, a long time ago. So I am optimistic, but for sure, I hope that our president will continue to press to invest in education for young women and men, because without the education, then this is all, we're going to fall well short of what our requirements are. Now, as to the Hyperloop idea, it seems a little bit futuristic, but it also seems very plausible. The key to deterrence is speed of recognition of what's happening, speed of decision to start movement, and then speed of assembly. How fast to demonstrate that we can move as faster than any potential adversary. And so a variety of things are necessary to increase that speed, from pre-positioning to actual transport capability. And so investment by our allies as well as the United States into improved transportation infrastructure that is protected from cyber attack, to me, that these are easily should be counted towards 2%, because they're just as important as having tanks or armored fighting vehicles or submarines. If you can't get there, then it doesn't matter.
Let me add to my distinguished colleagues, because education is a strategic enabler. And given the nature of our people, we have a comparative advantage in many ways. First, we have to get away from the idea that all those involved in the defense of our countries in Europe will be military. We'll have many civilians that are part of the, if you like, the defense establishment. Second, we have very advanced education techniques, distance learning, lifelong learning, simulation, a whole range of methods that I've been working on for many years, which can be adapted and applied to act as a strategic enabler, to give all our young people, as they come up through the ranks, the mission command information and experience they need to succeed at that level. Third, we have a structure of defense academies, of increasingly security academies, all of which are centers of excellence. We have one in particular, the NATO Defense College in Rome. What we need to do is harmonize, modernize our defense education programs so that we do indeed capitalize on our human capital at the heart of our technological capital in the future. Everything's there. It just needs the vision. Now, as for transportation, when I 21 years ago, in fact, I was a lead author for the so-called Venusberg report on the future of European defence. And one of our recommendations was that high-speed rail in Europe should be built to the gauge to carry our armed forces rapidly around the trans-European network. There has been some progress on this. So before we get into hyperloops, let's focus on exploiting our existing infrastructures to reinforce deterrence through, as Ben rightly says, the proven ability to move force and resource quickly over theatre. Alina?
Thank you, Julian. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to give all of three of our speakers, the co-authors, an opportunity to make any final comments as, what do you want people to really take away from this book? If you could summarize that. I think we already have some ideas on the table, but folks are hopefully going to be ordering this book with their discount code that we share from Oxford University Press. What do you hope the readers take away from it? And let me go in the order of John, Ben, and Julian to give you the closing word. John, please.
I would simply say that having a comprehensive integrated deterrence embraces every dimension of all that we've talked about today. Not because it's an American concept, but because it's the right concept. And the components of that is a well-prepared population in all of our countries that is capable of resilience, that is capable of embracing education going forward, that prepares those young women and men for the 21st century and the digital horizon, but also a comprehensive integrated deterrence that fully embraces the changes in technology so that any opponent who seeks to do us harm in any of the domains has to give pause, has to take some moment to consider how awful will be the response because of the deterrence that they know we have, both in terms of our capability and our willingness to apply it. Right now, we're not there, but we can be there with the right kind of attention. And you mentioned the scenario at the beginning. We put it in there to scare your socks off. If you read the one at the end, you'll be much more calm about where this could all go if it all comes together. And it's not a whole series of miracles. It can come together, actually.
Well, thank you, John. And yes, the opening scenario is a bit chilling and quite terrifying, but the book really takes you through the steps that we can take now and in the years ahead to avoid that kind of nightmare scenario. Ben?
Yeah, Alina, thanks. Well, obviously, I'm extremely proud to be associated with Julian Lindley-French and John Allen in doing this book. And I learned more from the process than I think anybody who reads it will learn. It really was an experience for me. 3 quick points. First of all, what did we see 6 weeks ago with thousands of Russian troops and armored vehicles massing around Ukraine? This was steel. It was the threat of a conventional attack using tanks, armor, artillery, and naval capabilities. So much attention on hybrid warfare. People forget that hybrid warfare includes the threat of nuclear destruction and armored attack and conventional naval attack and so on. So it's the full range. So future war, we still have to have that capability. Secondly, it will always be up to our elected officials, our political leaders, to explain the strategic objective and to bring along the population. It's not the job of the generals and the admirals to build up public support for what has to be done. It's the job of our elected civilian officials. So this book is aimed at them as much as it is to anybody that wears a uniform. Julian's right. It's not just people in uniform that have to defend our country. And then finally, none of this will work if America does not have allies. And it's not just about having a bunch of flags around the table. It's about, no kidding, us being trained to operate and fight together in all domains, in interoperable systems, and having achieved the policies that allow good intelligence sharing.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Julian.
Yeah, well said, Ben. America has the right to expect its allies in Europe to be capable allies. That's a fundamental message of the book. 3 days after HMS Hood blew up, the Bismarck was cornered by the Royal Navy and sunk. Out of a crew of 2,236, 2,200 died, tragically. The Bismarck was a wonderful battleship, but she was a battleship. And she was brought low by British naval power, by aircraft carriers. A year later, the United States proved what aircraft could do as the new technology of warfare when it sank the Japanese fleet at Midway. So however good your aging technology is, if there is a new disruptive technology, it could be destroyed. The second lesson was, however good the technology, if your strategy is rubbish, you will lose. And the Nazi strategy, thank God, was in the end of the day a very flawed strategy. But my third lesson, the one I want to leave you with, is I think something that we as Democrats on both sides of the Atlantic must always uphold. The Germans were my country's enemies. Now they're my country's close friends, and they'll always be our friends. We have no permanent enemies as democracies. We're always open to talk. We're always open to partnership. And that must always be the message we give to Russia and China. Yes, we are strong enough to resist you if you behave in a way we regard as inappropriate. But the door is always open to partnership. And that, if you like, is the final compelling message of a book that I had great pleasure and honor in preparing with my friends John and Ben. Thank you, Alina, for your great hosting of this important event.
Well, thank you, Julian and Ben and John. It was really my pleasure and such an honor to have this opportunity to have this important and yes, very compelling discussion about how we can avoid some of the nightmare scenarios leading ahead. And you know, I tend to be more of a cynic in my personal capacity, but this was a really inspiring conversation to me. As someone who's been working on the transatlantic relationship and issues related to it for a very long time. And I hope all of you have found that to be the case as well. The book, let's see if I can get it to not appear in my virtual background, and technology is not working for me. Future War and the Defense of Europe. I hope all of you have the opportunity to pick up your copy from Oxford. It's out officially in the United States on June 1st. Thank you so much. Again, John, wonderful to see you again. Ben, always a pleasure. And Julian, and to our audience who asked some of these really tough questions. I know we didn't get to all of them. And from all of us at SIPA, thank you for taking the time to be part of this discussion. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Be well.